All right, so hopefully I'm not going to bore you by backing up 3 slides, but that previous video went over, so I've got to trim off 1 minute and 22 seconds. So going back over this thing, we were talking about problems that were associated with the type of construction, and we came to the conclusion that there's a couple things that mud brick structures are, kind of characteristic of, which one of them was that they're subject to deterioration by weather, wind and water, rain that is. And the second thing is that it's not very attractive. So the Sumerians solved the problems through 2 different methods. One of them was through whitewashing with a pigmented form of paint that I believe was made from plants and possibly minerals and water. And then the other one was by using these colored pigmented clay cones that they would pound in to create a pattern. All right. So let me click. Come on, there it goes. This is an example of the clay cones and the essentially the cone mosaic that's produced by them. These things, think of them as sort of big clay nails that get pounded into a mud surface. Okay, they're fired from clay, and so they are more resilient to the elements than just the unfired mud brick. All right. This is an image of what it might look like, showing the sort of woven patterns. Here's a color image of the same thing or a similar thing. The black and white one shows the contrast a little bit better than this one does. This one it's all earth tones. So one of the key things that I want you to take away from this sort of presentation is that most of the structures for Sumeria, Babylonia were made of clay, were made of mud brick, and they lived in an area where the rivers flooded all the time. Now, bear in mind, what we're talking about here dates back 4,000 or 5,000 years. So, can you imagine how many floods have occurred in that time period? Right. So, a lot of that stuff just disappeared. A lot of what we have from these peoples is from their written history. So, moving forward to next development that we're going to talk about in relation to the Sumerian Babylonians is this thing called the ziggurat. Because there was this idea of flooding, right, there needed to be this counterpoint of high ground. So when it floods, you go to high ground, right? Get up above the water. Well, if you don't have high ground because you live in a giant sort of flood basin, then one of the options that you have is to build your high ground. And what they did is they created these things called ziggurats, which are related to the Egyptian pyramid. Symbolically, they have a similar function to the Egyptian pyramid, which is that they're a stepping stone or a ladder to the divine, to the gods. Okay? They also functioned as the seat of power for the rulers of the time. And remember, in an earlier slide, I mentioned to you that that the idea of the ruling class being linked to the divine, right, was what allowed them to rule. So, the temple or the ziggurat of Uruk is located down. So know where Babylon is, right? It's located down further. See the big arrow down here? All right, down closer to the Persian Gulf. Okay, so that gives you kind of a relative location. And this ziggurat contained at the top this thing called the White Temple. All right, so the ziggurat is obviously predominantly melted away. Correct. So remember that you're looking at what appears to be a mountain, right? But this is a flat plain. There are no mountains down there in the flat plain. So everything, this big giant mound that you're looking at, right, is man-made. They made a bunch of bricks and they stacked them up. Okay? So some of the things, this dates back to about 3000 BCE. And one of the things I want you to kind of be aware of is that they started to develop this notion of axes and symmetry. So if you look at the building, right, the plan of the building, that's kind of a a perspective view at the top, you'll note that it has a line of symmetry right up the middle, right? And that there are further pieces of embedded symmetry inside of it. There's also some asymmetry occurring in the plan. And that's going to be one of the things that we'll have you guys sort of do to kind of learn about symmetry, asymmetry, and axes. So one of the things I want you to note is that the sculpture on the side over here actually shows, you can't see it in the sculpture, but on the lap is a plan of a temple. All right? And so this goes back to their being able to record history. They knew how to draw a plan, right? So sort of Flintstone style with the chisel and that sort of thing. The next slide right here is a digital recreation of the ziggurat at Uruk and the white temple sitting on the top of it. You can see the singular stair kind of going up to the top of the ziggurat mound. Okay, and you can see a recreation of the temple. Notice that the openings are not very wide, right? If you look at the distance between these things, right, there's a lot more wall than there is opening. So continuing on, taking a look at sort of the inside of it, the effect of these small openings is going to have an impact on what you perceive the space to be like when you go inside. This is a digital rendering. This is not a real picture. It doesn't exist anymore. Okay? So you can see again, small openings, very narrow, more wall than there is opening. And you can see that it creates this sort of shadowy sort of condition. All right? Another more close-up shot of the White Temple sitting over top of a plan. And again, note the small openings, right? Even when you have a gap that's set back, the openings are still tiny compared to the this is not the opening, this is still wall. Okay? All right. So next we're going to go to a different city in this early Babylonian time, right? And it's the city of Ur. And I'm trying to find it. Oh, it's down here. It's below Uruk, closer to the, I'm sorry, over here. It's down closer to the Persian Gulf. Now, in this particular city, there is a very impressive ziggurat that has been rebuilt. Okay? So these images that you're going to look at are reconstructions of what existed there. You can see the ziggurat itself is this sort of raised mound, but the pyramid at the temple that would have been at the top has pretty much melted away. All right, probably not by floods, but by rain or wind and deterioration. So you can see that this pyramid had stairs that went up the sides and up the center. So I have a plan of it that I'm going to show you right now. And in this plan, you can see the temple was up at the top. That was the seat of power. That was where the god resided, or where they communicated with the god. And then you can see that there is this axial arrangement. There's this center line, right, that essentially creates the symmetry to either side. And you can see that there's a staircase to either side of the entrance gate, and then there's one that leads straight up to it. Okay? All right. How many minutes am I at there? 8? I'm good. All right. One of the reasons that I'm having you measure yourselves is so that you get an idea of how big something is. Short of going to, I believe, Iraq, which I don't think we probably want to go to Iraq right now, right? We might be able to. I don't know. I don't know what it's like for somebody to be a tourist there. It's hard to kind of understand the scale of something unless you can relate it to human form. Now, Joanna is much shorter than I am, right? I'm 6 feet tall. Joanna, you're 5'4" or something? 4'11". Or 4'11". Let's round it to 5. Okay, so 5 and 6. So, but it's not like Joanna's, 3 inches tall and I'm 10 feet tall. Between 5 and 6, there's not a huge difference. Okay? So, when you look at a human figure, whether it's something that looks smaller, that could be a child, right, or something that looks taller, that could be dad, or something that looks really tall with a child next to them, you start to get a scale of how big the building is. So part of what I want you guys to note here is the size of this scale of this, 4,000-year-old building in relationship to how big a human being is. To put it into perspective to something you might be aware of here, right? Our building that we're sitting in right now, if this is a human figure, our building is about this tall right here. Okay? Our 30-foot high technology blah 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 center, right, is nowhere near as tall as the overall thing. Okay? All right. So let's keep going. We're going to go on to a second period now. So remember I told you that the different cultures sort of flowered and then waned, and then another one would come along or take over that one, and then they would eventually be taken over or deteriorate. So the second period is called the Assyrian period, where the Sumerians and Babylonians focused on agriculture and basket weaving, and those were their industries. The Assyrians were warriors and hunters. They came from the north, so they were up further in the Fertile Crescent towards the Mediterranean, not at the Mediterranean, but towards it. And they essentially kind of, they captured the entire area. They took over the entire area, okay? So one of the things about these people is that they mastered this idea of a war chariot, right? So you've seen the pictures of like the people, the gladiators riding the thing. These guys were their predecessors. The gladiators came way later, like thousands of years later, okay? So these guys actually, were using the wheel, right? They were using animals. They had tamed them. They were using them for war, not just to eat, okay? They had two primary capitals.
12.
I'm sorry?
It's 12 minutes.
That's 12 minutes? I can go a little further. Let me see if I can finish this slide. So two capitals, Khorsabad and Nineveh. Nineveh, if any of you have gone to church, to say a Christian church, Nineveh is a city in the Old Testament, okay? So it may, for sure, it's in Jewish and Christian culture, and it may be in the Quran also, because all three of those religions came from this area, okay? They're all closely related to each other. So there was a time period, and I cannot go over 15 this time. There was a time period when a French archaeologist, Mr. Botta, okay, there's an architect named Botta too, by the way, thought he had discovered Nineveh. And again, Nineveh is a significant city in the Old Testament, all right? And that was about 1843, and he didn't realize it, but what he'd actually discovered is the city of Khorsabad, okay? So many of the panels that they discovered back then, these countries didn't have a lot of power, so the French would come in and say, "We are taking this back to the Louvre." Oh no, that's German. I can't do the French. Forget it. We're taking this back to the Louvre, and if you don't like it, tough luck. And so a lot of stuff was literally taken out of there and taken back to Europe. You'll see that they literally took the entire Ishtar Gate from another one of these cultures, and I think they took it to Berlin. And it's reconstructed inside of a building there. Okay? They did finally find where Nineveh was, but there was almost nothing left of it. All right? The massive walls in the structures that the Assyrians built supported vaulted roofs. Now, we'll talk about vaulting later, because it's really, even though it was used by other people, it was really perfected by the Romans. But vaulting is a way of spanning larger distances. Okay? We'll talk about it as we get further along. And then they also imported timber from Lebanon. So these people were bringing in stuff from lots of places in their empire. Their primary motif, right, was this winged man bull. Okay? So let's take a look at where it was, and I'm running out of time, so I got to stop it, so I'm going to stop at this slide. So good. Stop.